I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Divide and conquer. It's a political tactic. Where did it begin? In the United States of America, we have a constitution, and somewhere in there, when partisans decided to form parties, they discovered a tool, divide and conquer, for election time. We have lots of elections. We have transparency. So let's talk about it, what it does for the 21st century. Salena, Zito, and Lara Brown join me. Salena Zito of the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, and Lara Brown, who blogs at U.S. News and World Report. Salena has an excellent piece up at the Trib right now about her serendipitous walk through Winchester, Virginia. Winchester is in the Shenandoah Valley. It is associated with historically violent events in the Civil War. Salena points to the fact that it changed hands 70 times. That might be a minimum number during the war. It reminded me, and because Gettysburg is on my mind, it's 150 years later. There's a wonderful new book out, Alan Gelzo's book on Gettysburg. Winchester was at the center of Dick Ewell's corps moving north to Chambersburg. That was one of the corps that Lee had to fight at Gettysburg. And the battle at Gettysburg, you would think the two sides are delineated clearly. The Confederacy rebelling from the United States, and the Union defending the Constitution. Not so, I learned from Mr. Gelzo and others. The officers themselves in the rebel army, in the Confederate army, and in the Union army were divided, were conquered. There were partisans. The leading generals who arrived at the field on the 1st and 2nd of July were Democrats. They resented Mr. Lincoln. They resented Henry Halleck, the commander of the armies, the general-in-chief. They resented the fact that McClellan, George B. McClellan, had been relieved by Lincoln. McClellan was a Democrat. He favored the South. He thought the abolitionists were wrong. You see, the Union Army that fought and won at Gettysburg was divided. That's the nature of American politics, so nothing new here. I set all that up, Salena. You sent me thinking about it in your excellent essay, but you have a turn of phrase here about today's politics. Are the agents in Washington, Republican and Democrat, are they using this cynically? Do they distract us with their ability to divide and conquer us? Good evening to you, Salena.
Hey there. Thanks for having me on. Well, yes, both political parties do use it as sort of the way the founders intended it to be, to, divide and parse the partisans between each other. But also, I think what you have now, and you had it back in 1800, which most historians agree was the worst election ever. But what you have sort of amplified in this era is how the media divides and conquers us as well, and not just by politics, but by religion, by culture, by, rural versus urban. They use the whole thing to work in their advantage, and we now see networks, cable networks, that are partisan. There's a conservative one and there's a liberal one, and CNN sort of like bounces in between the two of them. So everything about us is split in half.
Lara, I want to take an example. Detroit, the Chapter 9 bankruptcy announced several days ago, is a disaster for the people of Detroit, for the people of Michigan, but no more so than the pensioners who are owed, who worked for, there are about 20,000 on the Detroit payrolls. They're not well-to-do people. Their average annual pension is $19,000. But I hear already partisanship about Detroit, about the bankruptcy. It's a catastrophe, but both parties and wings of the parties are using it to raise money, to beat the other guy. Is that the way we are, Lara? Have we fallen to this, or is that continuous? Salena mentions 1800. Have we been like that for 200 years?
Oh, we absolutely have. I mean, I think one of the things that is important to understand is that we essentially create these coalitions in our two-party structure, but quite frankly, we have many factions within each party's coalition. And our system, we tend to create the coalitions prior to the election, but if you jump over, say, across the pond and you look at England, these coalitions essentially get created after the election. So you end up seeing different sort of parties working more together to help them essentially govern. And this is nothing new. This is also just part of human nature. I mean, James Madison talks about the fact that essentially to disagree and these factions are sewn into the nature of man. There's nothing surprising. We disagree with one another. We believe we have different solutions, and oftentimes our arrogance always makes us believe that our solutions are the right ones.
I want to push this, Salena, because there's an observation, I think Lara might have made it, but I'll go to her in a moment. There's an observation now that the partisanship is so skilled, the federal, I'm thinking like 1800s, the government in Washington. The Washington partisanship is so skilled that the American people have turned the television off. Is that true, Salena?
Well, I think that at times that is true. People, sort of the traditional time to step away from politics is the summer. That's why people always say that people don't start paying attention to elections until after Labor Day. And I think that that's somewhat true. People turn off and they tune into their lives. But at the end of the day, they sort of can't help themselves. They're drawn back. They want to know. In a large part, they want to participate, and in a large part, they want to discuss and argue and agree and disagree, and we've done it forever, and we'll continue to do it, and it is what you call normal. And the last time I heard checked, you really can't cure normal. This is just how we are.
Lara, now I turn to the possibility that we've turned away from the television. It could be seasonal, but right now, because the partisans are so skilled, I don't expect them actually to solve any of the problems in front of us. Like Detroit, that's a real problem in front of us. Michigan doesn't want to help. The federal government doesn't want to help. And the 700,000 people left in Detroit pretty much are right to feel abandoned. Now, if that is true, if the federal government and the state government turn away, isn't it right for the American people to turn away from the state government and the federal government? If they won't help Detroit, why should we pay attention to them?
Well, sure. I mean, there is always the sort of attempt or desire to basically throw your hands up in the air and say, I'm done with this and I can't take it anymore and I'm not going to pay any more attention to these crazy people. But if everyone did that, then you end up with sort of a democracy of only those few who keep paying attention.
About a 50% vote turnout is what you wind up with. Isn't that where we are,
Lara? You end up with something more of like what happens with city council races, where you have 12% turnout. And unfortunately, those races usually end up going to essentially the people who get organized, the people who tend to be more ideologically sort of biased, and you really end up abdicating the system to either the corrupt or the extremists.
Salena, I'm going to stay with Detroit because it doesn't occur to me that it's a natural partisan story. Detroit is one of the great cities of North America. It certainly is the city that sponsored the GDP growth since the Second War, and it certainly contributed to the victory in the Second War. So Detroit is not especially a partisan story from my point of view, but it's being made into a partisan story. Is that a defeat, Salena, or is that the way it is?
Well, here's why it's being made into a partisan story. There hasn't been a Republican mayor in Detroit since 1957. And what happens is with machine politics, when you have one-party rule, is that you have no one to put the brakes or put a check on what happens when the entire party, and this goes for Republicans too, if they, ran a whole city themselves. And you see cities like this have problems because nobody stops the overspending. No one stops the credit card spending. No one stops continuously giving, good contracts to friends, big contracts to unions, and, building permits to friends, and there's no stopping sort of bad behavior and bad governance. And I think that that's the problem with Detroit. and the Democrats just happened to be the ones that were in leadership there, but it could have easily been all Republicans too. This would have happened if one party was just ruling the city, period, no matter who it was. Just happened to be the Democrats, and I think that ran it into the ground. There was no one to say stop. There was no one to say, well, you can't do that. And that's a problem for a lot of cities like Toledo and Gary, Indiana, places like that.
Lara, it's Capitol Hill to Detroit, drop dead. That's the end of the story?
Well, there are real problems, financially speaking, with actually bailing out a city like this. So Detroit is not alone, sort of with regard to having fiscal issues with their pension obligations and the like. And I think one of the things that you see is we've had smaller cities and smaller counties across this country filing for bankruptcy. So you get into this problem of, if you save Detroit, do you save Stockton in California? Do you reach out to San Bernardino County in Southern California? So it's not just a Detroit problem. It becomes a much larger moral hazard problem, as the economists would call it.
I agree with both of you on this instance. I'm just pushing this one more time. Salena, Capitol Hill to Detroit, drop dead, or do we solve this?
I don't know the answer to this. If you remember last year, Scranton went through the same sort of deal, and they stopped paying everybody. It's a problem throughout a lot of these cities, and I don't know if the solution is a bailout.
Lara, I'll give you a chance. Because Washington is a place we look to for this scale of bailout, is the Obama administration on the line here? Or do they take risks if they ignore Detroit?
Well, I think the risks that they have and the problem that they have is they actually did bail out sort of the entire auto industry. So there are kind of precedents on the books for them extending, generous sort of hands to troubled industries. And the problem is, once you start doing that, how do you draw the boundary and how do you draw the line? And certainly because, as Salena points out, the Democrats have a long history in Detroit. That puts more pressure on the Obama administration to do something.
Salena Zito, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. Lara Brown, who blogs at U.S. News and World Report. Detroit, 1965, it had 1.7 million people. 2013, it has about 700,000. There's the problem. I'm John Batchelor.